the starting point for the dissolution is not a total dissolution. It is if you like, trimming away at the edges. And this is what really, I think, challenges the traditional view that we're all told that Henry VIII dissolves monasteries because he has his eye on the prize, if you like, on the very wealthy monasteries that whose money he covets. Actually, the starting point is almost the complete inverse of that. The starting point is he has an eye on the poorest. He has an eye on those that are no longer viable, that are absolutely on their knees. Maybe the property that they were given when they were created was simply never going to be enough. And 200 or 300 years on, it absolutely isn't enough anymore. The numbers in living there are too small to be sustainable. Maybe they've not had new recruits in many years. And that, for the first half of the 1530s, right up until really 1537, that is the target. Trim away those smaller institutions and make the best of the rest. Make those that remain the very best that they can be, of course, aligned to what Henry wants, the kind of regime for the church that Henry and Cromwell are planning. So those that remain, in his view, must be very much aligned to the royal plan for the church. So a church that is really almost a branch of state authority, ensuring that his subjects across England and Wales are loyal to him and to his new headship of the church, and that the leading monasteries should become almost like a sort of English version of the Habsburgs' Escorial, you know, a sort of palace monastery, a great palatial church institution that sort of reflects glory back towards the king. That's clearly his plan, right the way through, almost to the end of the decade, that having trimmed away the smaller, poorer places, we can almost double down on those great institutions, you know, the Westminster Abbeys and the Glastonburys and the St. Albans Abbey and Bury St. Edmunds Abbey, these great royal monasteries that will just add luster to the kind of head of the church that he wants to be.
So with that, putting himself as the head of the church, so before that point, he's not got any authority to do these closures. But with that, then he's combining state and the state religion into one thing, and so he's now in charge, and that's how he gets the power to do this.
Yes, absolutely. So if you look at the text of that statute of supremacy that he passes in 1534, the blueprint for what I've been describing is all there. Actually, it's a very short statute, but it's all there because he gives himself, as head of the church, the right to, as he says, visit. So and that's not just passing through as a guest. Visit, as in place under scrutiny and investigation, all church institutions in England, and that's not just monasteries, but cathedrals, parish churches, and those foundations like schools and colleges, which are ecclesiastical, including the universities. He gives himself the right to put them under his scrutiny and jurisdiction. And he says in the statute of supremacy that extends to the right, where necessary, to reform them. And the reform he has in mind at that stage isn't stripping away all traces of Catholic doctrine. The reform he has in mind is the kind of rationalization that I've been speaking about, that he gives himself the right in the statute to make a decision. Some of these churches and their monastery communities are viable, some of them are not. Some of them are not well managed, they should go. And that's what traditionally in the church a visitor did, and in fact, actually in the Church of England still today, the visitor is the purpose of the visitor is really to make a judgment: is this institution efficiently managed? It's a bit like a sort of grand audit of an institution. And even before Henry VIII, where a bishop visited a church institution and felt there's something very funny going on with the financial management of this institution, they could make drastic interventions. And Henry really is, all he's doing is taking that existing machinery of how to manage church institutions, and he's just putting himself in charge of it. He's taking it away from the traditional church authorities and he's giving it to himself, but he's applying it in the same way. And yeah, it's all there in 1534. And what's interesting is that the leaders of monasteries and priories, they sign up to this. They are not in principle opposed to the king assuming these this authority and this old machinery of subjecting institutions to that kind of scrutiny. They'd always been quite equivocal about archbishops, bishops, and the papacy using those kinds of mechanisms to subject them to scrutiny. And in some ways, I think monastery leaders are possibly even more inclined to accept royal authority over the way that they run themselves than they are church authority. They'd always been suspicious of the papacy in England, and for really quite sort of simple reasons. They'd always been suspicious of the foreignness of the papacy. They'd always been suspicious of the grasping, money-hungry tendency of the papacy tending to cream off money from churches around Christendom and then use it to its own ends. So I think it's pretty clear that within months of Henry making himself head of the church, the view in the leadership of monasteries is, in many respects, this could be for the better. In many respects, this could be a sort of reset for us. The problem of smaller, poorer monasteries is going to be taken away from them. They no longer have to worry about how on earth do we keep this poor old institution going because it's on its knees. And they have reason to be confident, because if Henry is saying, I'm going to take you under my wing and we're going on a really promising and exciting journey together, I think for a time the monastery leaders are inclined to take that at face value. That they're well aware of the close relationship between state and church that is emerging in other parts of Europe, and how that has been the beginning of a kind of beautiful friendship. So, and Cromwell has got a good, close personal relationship with some of these heads of monasteries in England. And I think that not only are they inclined to think in general terms, the crown may protect us, but I think they feel we know these people personally. Henry has been very present in and out of some of the main monasteries in England, the leading monasteries. In the early part of his reign, he spends lots of time at places like Reading Abbey, St. Albans Abbey, Westminster. So they know the Tudor regime at a personal level. They sort of know its human face. And I think that helps to build a sense that this is not an end of something, but it is actually a new beginning that could be positive.
So it feels like it's going to be mutually beneficial, maybe a big change, but it's for the best. It's taking everyone forward.
Absolutely.
Modernizing.
Yes, that this is a sort of a new departure, but one that doesn't necessarily carry with it a real threat. And I think that feeling continues in many respects for another 18 months, 2 years after Henry's headship is confirmed by Parliament. And it's really only after the shock to everyone of the uprising, the rebellion that we know of as the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, that perhaps there is an awareness that this new relationship with the crown is volatile, and that the future direction of that relationship is now much more uncertain than it had been 18 months previously. So I think for much of 1535, there's still a sense, yes, we need to get with the project. We need to really get behind this. I think the leadership are really trying to ensure that they bring their monks with them. But then for Henry personally, I think historians generally agree that shock that some of his subjects do not share his vision for a Tudor future in 1536. That shock is actually shared by many different constituencies, and I think as they emerge from that moment of rebellion into the closing years of the decade, things do become much more unpredictable, much more sort of febrile, and there's no doubt that some of that sense that of common cause between monastic England and the king is beginning to fracture.
So what was the what I suppose created the Pilgrimage of Grace, and what actually happened to make them gather and decide that they needed to talk to the king about?
It's a sort of what today I suppose we call a kind of perfect storm. It's a coming together of different things. So the new taxation regime that is being rolled out in provincial England is profoundly resisted by local gentry in the northern counties, coupled with or coinciding with the first phase of the closure of smaller monasteries, smaller, less viable monasteries, in the late spring and summer months of 1536. And that's a very visible spectacle, whilst the imposition of new financial levies is one that sort of, if it doesn't come across your eyes, it certainly hits the pocket. And I think it is the coincidence of those things, the sense that the crown is coming after your hard-earned livelihood at the same time as that old certainty on your horizons of that tower, that church, that cluster of buildings that's always been on your horizons and that your family have been connected with time out of mind, is suddenly being closed. And that early phase in the East Midlands and over the Humber into the north, of closures in April, May, and then into the summer months, August, September, especially of 1536, it's the only phase really of closures of monasteries that really truly is efficiently done. And so people in those counties would have seen something very new happening, unfolding in front of their eyes. And it's clear that the Tudor regime is feeling its way rather. And so you're getting lots of people milling about. The accounts of the monasteries that are caught up in the rebellion make very clear that one of the really striking things is because the king's commissioners have arrived to close these places, that there isn't quite literally a lot of standing around. There are members of these monastery communities who are now told you can no longer go back into your church and continue your daily monastic life, but nor can you leave until you've got a license to leave. And one of the reasons that when the rebellion very beginning, it starts in the Lincolnshire town of Louth. One of the reasons that episode that happens after evensong one day, that it attracts such a crowd, is clearly there are crowds of these sort of demonasticized priests wandering about. They don't quite know where to go or what to do. And we have descriptions of them. One of them who's sort of wearing half of his habit, and he's also borrowed a jacket from a layman. So, and to the local neighbourhood, this must have looked very strange. People that they were accustomed to see wearing a habit, and now they've got somebody's borrowed jacket, and they've got a cap that they've picked up from somewhere, and yet underneath all of that, they are still dressed as a priest. And that sort of visibly unsettling spectacle, I think, really does serve to sort of intensify the sense of upheaval, and it's an indication that the royal regime may have quite well thought through reasons for rationalising, as I've said, but actually how to put this into effect hasn't really been thought through, and closing, even making clear that it's smaller, less viable institutions being closed. When it comes to actually implementing that, given that so many of these places cluster around centres of population, to the people on the ground, that doesn't look like just a handful of places being taken out. It looks like a sudden transformation of your own town. And there was a high concentration of smaller, poorer monasteries in Lincolnshire, in Yorkshire, in Lancashire. And so in those parts of the country, undoubtedly, it would have felt as if the royal regime has arrived in town and it's going to leave your town utterly transformed. And I think that fuels the anxiety. But it becomes clear that this is not primarily a rebellion about challenging Reformation or supporting monasteries. It's about challenging interference in the locality. Henry is determined, if he's ever consistently determined on one thing, he's determined on a kind of uniform authority across what is still a very provincial kingdom. Royal authority in reality isn't easily imposed in a uniform way right across the Kingdom of England and Wales that Henry inherits in 1509. What he wants to do is to establish a kind of uniform authority that means the same in Lancashire as it does in London. And that's what people are resisting in 1536. And it's clear that they're not opposed to the principle of a Tudor king. They're opposed to the principle of centralization and institutionalization of government. And they see this visibly with the closure of small monasteries, financially with the imposition of new taxes, and they challenge it.
Was there any attempt to communicate with the wider communities what was happening? Yes.
I mean, one of the things that I've done my best to investigate, I'd love to turn up more indications. Historians have often said, oh, well, this is in a sense, a storm in a teacup, because what's happening in 1536 in the late summer and autumn is rather confined geographically to a particular area of the kingdom. But it's pretty clear that other parts of the country are following what's happening very closely. There is evidence of other monastery communities showing sympathy, not necessarily doing more than expressing sympathy for what's happening and criticism of how the regime is reacting. We don't know for certain if individuals associated with monastery communities, say in the south of England, decide to hurry off to the north and join the band of rebels. But it's not inconceivable that they do. And there is a sense in the regime itself that it's possible that other regions of the country are not that far from this kind of upheaval and challenge as well. So there is, I think, at least until probably the spring of 1537, there is a fear that the reverberations of this could extend further. But 1530s England and Wales, as I've said already, are very provincial places, provincial in the sense of not being well connected. We know that it takes even a royal messenger on a series of horses, 2.5 to 3 days to get from London to York. This is, and unlike many parts of mainland Europe, this is still very much what we might call a kind of manuscript culture, that information is carried by scraps of parchment and scribbled notes, and by messengers on horseback, by word of mouth. It becomes clear when one works through the surviving letters and papers from these years of the 1530s, just how frustrating for everybody the difficulties of communication really are. Even the commissioners of the crown charged with closing down small monasteries in 1536, not just because of the Pilgrimage of Grace, they give up by about October, because they say so many parts of the country that they need to go to are no longer passable. The roads are flooded or filled with mud, and you cannot get anywhere in many parts of England in any serious way between late October and about the end of February. And I think that stands as an obstacle to the direct action of potential challengers, but it also stands as a huge obstacle to Henry's ambition. And this is why there is always, it seems, a disjunction, you might say, between Henry's ambition to have uniform authority across his kingdom and his likelihood of achieving it, because the kingdom's infrastructure is just not adequate to achieve that. England is unusual in Europe for having fewer large, well-developed cities outside of the capital and York. England is a kingdom really of medium-sized and smaller towns rather than major cities. If you compare it to, say, Rhineland, Germany in the early 16th century, or much of the Kingdom of France, where you've got well-developed, highly capitalized, very sophisticated cities, you don't really see breakout of London, York, Bristol in the reign of Henry VIII. You really haven't got many other places that are anything like as developed as that, and that really is shaping the kind of course of reformation that we see in the 1530s, I think.
It's interesting. Even Henry can be floored by a bit of mud.
Yes, absolutely. And it's amusing now, but one of the joys of reading some of the correspondence that the King's agents are sending back to Westminster or to Thomas Cromwell in his office in Austin Friars in the City of London, are those practical things that, it's sometimes they move with incredible speed. I mean, in the summer, you can tell that the roads are really hard and impacted. One of the commissioners manages to get from South Somerset to Bristol, which is a journey of 45 miles or so, And they managed to get there in an afternoon, which is extraordinary. I mean, you'd struggle today just because of the queues of the traffic, but to do that on horseback is remarkable. But then there are other times when, yes, they can see where they want to get to, but they just can't get through the roads. And I think one of my frustrations perhaps with the way that we have tended to represent the Tudors as a great modernizing force is that we've lost sight of just how they may be modernizing in their ambitions, but those are ambitions played out in a very medieval landscape. And we mustn't forget that. You know, Henry VIII is, he's remarkable in many ways. He has ambitions to be a great Renaissance monarch, but the canvas that he's working on is no different from his medieval predecessors, from Henry V or Edward III, really.
What was the Valor Ecclesiasticus and what was its purpose?
So the Valor is best understood, I think, as the Tudor Doomsday Book. So it's an audit of the property and income of all church institutions, not just monasteries, all church institutions. It's intended, above all, first and foremost, simply for Henry to understand what is the scale of this thing, the church in England, that he has now effectively become chief executive of.